China. Before we turn to today's event, we hope you'll join us for our next series of events. On July 15th, we will be meeting to discuss what a worker-centered trade policy and legislation might look like. And on July 21st, we will be hosting Congressman Jimmy Gomez. Also, the last week of July, we're going to be hosting a big event discussing sustainability and the circular economy as part of our Trade and Environment series. Information on all these events can be found on the WITA website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've seen our WITA webinars before, we like to call out the names of some of those you are in community with on today's session, even if you can't see them in Zoom. Welcome then today to Joellen Urban at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Alexander Feldman at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, Carrie Desmond at Lockheed Martin, and Lynn Fisher-Fox at Arnold & Porter. Welcome, Joellen, Alexander, Carrie, and Lynn, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to some of those towards the end of our program. You may have noticed that Congressman Rick Larsen is not yet on camera. Rick is finishing up some votes in the House, and we are still expecting him to join us, but just a few minutes into the session. But we did send you a copy of the event program with our panelist biography, so you won't need a lengthy intro for each of these folks, but I do want to say a special welcome to everyone for joining us today, Matt Goodman, Naomi Wilson, and our moderator, Bonnie Glaser. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we look forward to hosting Rick when he can, as soon as he can join us and turn on the camera. Bonnie.
So thank you, Ken. Privileged to be here with you for this important conversation. I'm Bonnie Glaser. I direct the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And let me give you an introduction to our topic, and then I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll get into our conversation. President Biden has said that the United States is in extreme competition with China. And that competition, of course, extends to many realms, military, diplomatic, economic, and even to some extent ideological. But the most crucial arena of competition is in technology. And in most areas of technology, the United States is still the global leader. But China has ambitions to become the top innovator in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, quantum computing, and other strategic technologies of the 21st century. So the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act of 2021, or USICA, is what we're going to talk about today. It roughly is authorized roughly $250 billion for technology research over a 5-year period. And this bill was a collaboration between Senators Schumer and Young. One of the things it includes is about $52 billion in emergency funding to the Department of Commerce for chip development and production. So we're going to talk a little bit about semiconductors, and it commissions $1.5 billion for 5G innovation. And another key feature of the bill is institutional. It is going to rename, or proposes to rename, the National Science Foundation to the National Science and Technology Foundation. And that is set to receive $81 billion of the next 5 years. And it includes $10 billion to set up a new directorate for technology and innovation. And that directorate would be aimed at creating stronger leadership in critical technologies through research in technology-focused areas, and also bolstering education and expanding federally funded research projects to national security, energy, and domestic manufacturing. So we're going to talk about this bill and the U.S. strategy to compete with China. So with us today, we have Matt Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Matt previously served as Director for International Economics and the National Security Council staff. And we also have Naomi Wilson, who is Vice President of Policy Asia at the Information Technology Industry Council. And she previously was Acting Director for Asia Pacific at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So we're going to jump into this, Matt and Naomi, and talk about this bill and about the issue of competition with China. So the USICA extends the role of the federal government in sectors that are deemed to be strategic, such as, of course, the semiconductor industry. And it does so through various mechanisms, including incentive programs, increased research and development funding, and, as I mentioned, the creation of some new government offices. And this really signals a shift to using industrial policy as a mechanism to direct the development of certain tech industries. So my question to start off with is this the right approach? Some people might say we're trying to out-China China. Is this the best way to allocate capital and to compete with China? So I'll start with you, Matt.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie, and thanks, Ken, and to WITA for inviting me today. Delighted to be here. Important topic, and look forward to Naomi's comments and Congressman Larsen's as well. Very important thinkers on these issues. So, if I can just, I think the answer is yes. We do need an industrial policy, and we've had one for a long time, and we just need to sharpen it and do it in a smart way. But if I can just frame it, actually, I want to read. And it gets to your point from the last, I want to read the last paragraph of George Kennan's long telegram, in which he said, finally, we must have courage and self-confidence to cling to our own methods and conceptions of human society. After all, the greatest danger that can befall us in coping with this problem of Soviet communism is that we shall allow ourselves to become like those with whom we are coping. And so that's important for two reasons. One is the mention of self-confidence. You know, we're all kind of stressed out and maybe a little gloomy about things, but I think we need to be more confident about our position. I would rather have the US economic problems than China's economic problems. And I think we need to start from that perspective when we do things like sharpen our innovative edge through legislation like USICA. And then, you know, we need to do this in a way that isn't like China. We don't want to become like China. We need to be true to ourselves. And that means doing industrial policy in a way that is based on, you know, market mechanisms. We want the private sector to succeed. The federal government needs to be involved in both basic research and in you know, sending market signals that help advance technologies that might otherwise not be developed or be commercialized. So there is an important role, and it's disingenuous to say that we haven't or shouldn't do industrial policy. You know, we have for a long time. We just need to do it better and smarter. So that's my basic answer. Lots of, you know, specifics under that.
Great. Naomi, what's your view on this, and how would you respond to people who would say that we are pursuing basically China's approach to innovation rather than the US approach?
I think you both hit it exactly on the head, which is we don't want to try to out-China China. You know, industrial policy has kind of taken on a negative connotation over the past few years, but I think especially in light of the pandemic, we've recognized that there is a really important strategic role for the government to play, which the US government has always played, regardless of what we've called it in the past or shied away from calling it. And so, you know, there are definitely areas that are important for both national security and economic security in which the US government needs to make those front-end investments. And as long as they're not picking winners and losers, I think that there's room for the government and the private sector to work together to get the best outcome.
So talking about winners and losers, one of the criticisms I think that US and other Western countries have had of China's tech industry and the Chinese government's role in that is the provision of massive state subsidies. So essentially picking the winners and losers. So start with you, Naomi. How should the US and its allies and partners deal with this problem? Is this something that should be addressed in the World Trade Organization that maybe should be updated to deal with the issue of state subsidies? Should we be addressing this through bilateral trade negotiations with China? What are the tools that we have to promote fair competition and technological development?
Yeah, no, the industrial subsidization in excess in China continues to be a real problem, and we need to approach it through each of the mechanisms that you outlined. There's no one way that's going to shift China's behavior. It's going to take action through the WTO. It's going to take a coalition effort and that consistent pressure on China. Obviously the subsidies are bad for a number of reasons, including that they've yielded problems in the past with respect to overcapacity and also unfair competition. But it's also important not to overblow the advantage that this gives China in certain sectors. So, for example, China's poured a ton of money into semiconductors over the past decade plus, and yet they still don't have the most competitive technology and companies as compared to the leading semiconductor companies. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that China dumping money into a specific industry does not necessarily yield positive outcomes for them. So, while we need to address the inherent unfairness there, and there's absolutely a need to address it in the WTO, we also need to have trust in our own system that our companies can compete regardless of what they're faced with. Though, of course, a level playing field is absolutely what we're aiming for.
Matt, what's your view on this? If state subsidies are not working for China, should we ignore the problem and
No,
let them throw good money after bad?
Well, there's some truth in that, but I think we have to be a little more proactive than that. But I think Naomi has really nailed it. But just to say, I think my earlier comment about, China having more economic problems than ours, I stand by, but I don't want that to be interpreted as saying that that we don't have a problem with China. There are lots of problems in China, just in the economic realm. And massive subsidization and industrial policies is one of them. Among others, they're also still forcing technology transfer. They're stealing intellectual property. They're coercing other countries in the economic domain, which is totally unacceptable. So there's a range of things from problematic to unacceptable that we have to worry about, and massive subsidization is one of them. Unfortunately, the WTO is not very well suited to deal with this, because we set it up at a time when countries were providing, if I give you, Bonnie, $1 and I don't give Naomi $1, Naomi can sue me for favoring you over her, a very specific sort of subsidy. This kind of massive structural industrial policy was not something envisaged by the WTO, and it's really not adequate to address it. So we're going to need some serious reform. That's going to take a while. We're going to need to do some other things in the interim. I think one of the best things that Bob Lighthizer did as USTR under Donald Trump was to start this trilateral discussion with EU and Japan, which covered a range of, it was not explicitly stated, but Chinese practices, including the subsidization, and talked about ways that they could counter that, short and long term. And I think reviving that trilateral discussion on this set of issues would be very valuable.
So I want to talk about a couple of the specific features of the bill. For those of you who don't know, this is a 2,400-page bill. I have not read it, and I'm guessing that our panelists haven't read all of it either. But there are a few specific aspects of it that have been criticized by some members of the Senate, and so I wanted to raise the objections or concerns that some of the senators have. And the first is about intellectual property theft. This is a long-standing problem with China, and the Trump administration did take some actions to try and curb it. Obviously, the Obama administration did. This has been going on for years. But Senator Richard Burr, Republican from North Carolina, argued that the bill doesn't adequately address this problem. So I wonder, Matt and then Naomi, whether you can weigh in on whether you think the way that the bill is trying to address this is right? What do you think the US really should be doing to curb intellectual property theft?
Well, first of all, just to acknowledge, it is a huge problem. I mean, there have been various estimates that it's costing the U.S., hundreds of billions of dollars. You pick your number, but it's a big problem still today. I mean, I do think the Chinese central government has a more complicated view on this issue than it used to. I think it understands that protecting intellectual property is kind of important to China also, and they're trying to do a better job than in the past, but they can't fully enforce it, and I'm guess that in some areas they don't want to. So it's still a huge problem. We do have, this has been a longstanding issue in U.S.-China relations, and in our broader trade policy, we've got various tools already that are meant to deal with this, including provisions that prevent us importing goods that have stolen intellectual property in them. And these laws need to be better enforced, and we need to probably add provisions. Whether the provisions, I should have said at the beginning, as you said, USICA is still in the works. I don't think for us it would be appropriate to comment on sort of line by line items. For one thing, those are going to change, and for another, that's not really my job. But I would say it is important, I think, as part of this overall effort to improve our competitiveness, to ensure that we aren't letting anybody steal intellectual property. And if the laws are not strong enough and not being enforced well enough, we ought to add some tools. I'm not sure this is the highest priority for this bill. I'd like to see it focused more on the domestic investments we need to make, as it does. And so that's, I think, where the focus should be. But certainly this is a big problem that needs to be addressed.
So, Naomi, on this topic, I'm sure you recall that under the Obama administration, there was an agreement between the United States and China to not use cyber means to steal intellectual property and then applied for commercial advantage. And I think there was some belief that this, although of course wouldn't 100% solve the problem, that it was a good move, but then seems to have not stuck as an agreement. So if I'm mischaracterizing that, you can certainly provide your perspectives on it. But is there a way to get, if that was the right approach, is there a way to get back to it? Is that something we should be doing? And what else should we be doing to address China's intellectual property theft?
Sure. Well, I worked on the agreement in the Obama administration, so I certainly hope that it had a helpful impact, and at least the initial indications were that there was a significant change in China's behavior. However, I think it is important to point out that China's tactics change over time. So when people talk generally about IP theft, there's still this old notion of China just steals everything. They don't create anything. And that's no longer true. And we need to stop telling ourselves that. And so while IP theft continues to be a problem, it is important to recognize that Chinese companies are competitive in their own right. They are innovating, they're creating their own technology. And that is in part why the Chinese government has taken a different tactic over the past few years and recognized they need to improve their own IP laws and how they handle IP theft in court. That's not to say that there are no problems, but when we look at the big picture, it's no longer the top tier problem, at least in the tech sector, to have exfiltrated, tech transfer or theft of intellectual property. Really, what we worry about is the tech transfer on the ground through forced partnerships or through intrusive security review regimes. But all of that is also to say that one bill cannot accomplish all of these issues. It can't address all of these issues. And I think the focus is right on competitiveness. on making sure that we're shoring up our own skills and abilities at home, so that we can compete effectively with China. And we have to continue to address these issues on a rolling basis. But I do worry about the oversimplification of the IP theft debate, and that it lends itself to this narrative of we just need to stop China from stealing and then we'll win, because that's really not a productive narrative.
The other criticism I thought I'd raise is by Senator Bernie Sanders, who has criticized the bill for providing funding to some of the largest and most profitable corporations in the country, using Senator Sanders' words. So how do you respond to this concern? Is it fair, Naomi?
I think it certainly makes sense to look at how money is being spent. But when you look at the broader landscape of how governments attract investment, this is not unusual. And the bottom line is that the US has to offer incentives in the form of grants, funding, tax incentives, land grants, in order to attract the type of investment and competition that they want. So, while the US government absolutely should not be expected to match funding of the private sector, for example, it is the standard operating procedure, if you will, across different governments. And I'm not just talking about China, but Korea, Singapore, Japan, they all offer tax breaks and other incentives in order to lure multinational companies to do their work in country. And this is important for economic reasons. It's important for jobs and the number of high-skilled jobs that building these types of, for example, fabs will attract. And as we've seen over the course of the pandemic, it's also important for security reasons and public health and safety. There are certain parts of the supply chain that it behooves us to have closer to home and closer to the people who need access to those products and services. So, while I understand it can be a bit of a tough swallow to see a lot of money going towards any given thing, we need to think in terms of long-term investment and competition, not only with China, but with other countries who are offering these incentives.
Matt?
Well, I think I'd start with semiconductors themselves, and whether this is a sector or a product that is so important to our economic competitiveness and or our national security that we need to kind of take a special approach. And I'm not a technologist, but I talk to enough people and that convince me that this is probably a special category of technology that is foundational, as to use the term of art, and probably needs some special thought and special policies to ensure that we remain competitive. When I say we, I mean the allies and partners, not just the United States collectively. We have intervened in this space before. Back in the 1980s, I started, cut my teeth in policy and back in the days of trade friction with Japan in the 1980s. And we were then feeling very much under threat from Japan as taking over the semiconductor industry. And we set up a government-private partnership called Sematech, which most analysts think was pretty effective in a targeted way in supporting the competitiveness of our semiconductor industry. By the way, Japanese companies are now part of Sematech. It's a whole different world. It still exists. But I think that's the key is being smart about it. I mean, I do think this probably, deserves some special support, but I'd still go back to the best thing we can do is, first of all, to do the basic investment, federal investment in R&D. We need to get that back up, it fell from about 2% of GDP at the peak of the Cold War to, or really the space race, down to about 0.6% of GDP. We need to get that back up above 1% or so. We need to then, use federal government spending power to sort of send market signals like, buying AI enhanced solutions to data management for tax records, for the government. We're buying fleets of electric vehicles. And then in targeted ways, maybe for some sectors, we needed to provide some incentives for them to invest in in domestic manufacturing. But I just would be a little cautious. I think Senator Sanders has a point that the companies should be there. These are profitable companies. They ought to be first investing themselves in R&D, and then to the extent the federal government needs to provide some incentive to that, I think that is appropriate. But against the backdrop of a broader set of policies.
You made the point earlier, Matt, that of course this bill will evolve. There's lots of things that may change about it, including allocation of some of the funding. But I want to get into the weeds on at least one question related to allocation of funding, and that's semiconductors, which it allocates $52 billion. John Neufer, who's the president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, has said that building one leading edge fab in the US would cost about $30 billion. So from that perspective, I guess, $52 billion doesn't sound like a whole lot of money. And then if we look at the R&D allocation, I think there is quite a bit of support for increasing government investment in R&D, which has really diminished over the years. So picking that back up again is very important. But this USICA bill allocates only $13 billion over the next 5 years. So just again, to throw out one figure, TSMC, Taiwan's leading semiconductor firm and the leading firm in the world, plans to spend $6.3 billion on technology development in 2021 alone. So is this the right allocation? This bill sounds like a lot of money for $250 billion over 5 years, but maybe it's really a drop in the bucket. So comments on that. Start with you, Matt.
Well, I mean, again, I think that we do need to spend more federal money on research and development. And as I said, I didn't say, I guess, but we did a report last year as part of the CSIS Trade Commission on sharpening America's innovative edge. And our first recommendation was actually to get federal funding of R&D back up above 1% of GDP. And that's going to cost about $100 billion a year extra. So that's a significant, this bill is kind of in line with that in terms of orders of magnitude. The precise allocation of where you spend that, again, I would put more emphasis on the basic and then on the federal purchases that send market signals of various things that we want to incentivize, and then on some of the other bridging activities that the federal government usefully does between basic research and commercialization. There's a so-called valley of death, and Naomi can probably talk more about that. But there's certain things the federal government can do to incentivize market players to develop technologies. Supporting smaller companies, supporting education. I mean, there are a bunch of things that really is where these money should be, I think, most usefully spent. And then, in some cases where there's a particularly critical technology that we may need to have, a certain amount of reliable, manufacturing of and supply of, there may be a case for more targeted investments.
Naomi, your view?
Yeah, so it is a lot of money for government. And it's a lot of money, full stop. But as I said earlier, we can't expect the government to match private sector funding. And we need to look at how companies like TSMC amass that type of funding. And it is through sales, and in part, in sales to China and Chinese companies. And so, in the broader supply chain context and the research and development cycle, context, it's important to keep that in mind too. One of the best things that government can do is continue to enable sales, because those profits are ultimately funneled back into research and development. And that's what keeps those companies at the cutting edge, able to invest so much in next generation technologies and in moving, their fabs and manufacturing facilities to the most appropriate geographical places in the world. So it's important to keep that in mind. And the U.S. government has an important role to play in R&D, absolutely. But it needs to be strategic. It needs to be in those areas that may not have market success immediately, but down the road could be really important for health and safety or for national security reasons. And so having the government be that type of protective incubator of emerging technology that doesn't necessarily have a marketability just yet, but is equally important from a national and economic security perspective, that's the really important role, in my view, for the U.S. government. So
maybe we'll take a question from our audience. Ken, I think you're collecting questions. Why don't you go ahead and pose one?
Thanks very much. We are indeed. We've got a couple good ones that have come in already. I want to follow up, though. One of them, Naomi, kind of goes right to what you were just talking about a little bit. And Matt, I think I'd welcome your thoughts on this. You all know what Arpanet was. It was a distributed packet information system developed in the 1960s. I'm actually not reading from the Wikipedia page. That became the precursor to the internet. And that was research that was a collaborative effort between universities and later the military. Was sort of a kind of push-pull between the two of them, between academia and the military, for this communication network to be able to survive a nuclear war, essentially. That was why this was created. Do we see it? Obviously, if you guys knew what that next technology was or what those technologies were, you'd be an investor in Silicon Valley right now or somewhere else around the world. But are we talking about this kind of investment? I mean, that the kind of investments we were making, they were very kind of military centric 50 and 60 years ago, but now they'd be more commercial. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about, broad-based? And Matt, you did highlight the fact that the kind of subsidies China's doing across the board are very different from what the WTO envisioned, where it was sector specific, company versus company, or sector versus sector. Is this the kind of investment across the board that the United States needs to make to compete for the rest of this century?
Yes, I mean, I that's the simple answer. I don't know that it needs to be focused exclusively on military applications. Of course, that's where a lot of the money is, and so it's natural for certain technologies to develop out of those test beds. But this is where the Department of Energy plays a really important role here. Where not a lot of people are aware, because it's considered like a smaller kind of under the radar type department, but they're essential in basically identifying new projects and providing grants to companies and individuals with good ideas that need a kind of sandbox to test them in and develop future technologies. The other example that I use a lot, which is pertinent to our times, is vaccines. If you listen to any of the many interviews with the incredible scientists and innovators who created the mRNA vaccines, I mean, there were endless trials and failures along the way over periods of decades, and ultimately it was the ability to reorient kind of current projects into the current state of affairs. But that requires, a willingness to invest in things that might fail, but ultimately are exceptionally important to the long-term health and prosperity of society.
Can I just pick up on that last point that Naomi made? We did in that, well, actually another report a year or two ago about industrial policy, and we looked at different countries' experiences, Europe and Japan, and here we looked at DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, as it was ultimately called. And what were the kind of keys to its success? It was, among other things, responsible for the internet and GPS and a variety of other things that we use in daily life today. Some of the keys to success were first of all, bringing in really high quality talent from the private sector for a limited period, or from academia for a limited period of time, and then giving them kind of a blank, check, or, letting them go out and try and experiment on different things and fail. They were actually encouraged in a way to try and fail. That's really an important part of this. And it doesn't only have to be in DARPA, as Naomi said. The Department of Energy, other parts of the government can do similar things and are doing similar things. But this is part of what smart industrial policy involves. And we do have to do that. I think the massive subsidization across a whole bunch of, national champions or favored private sector companies is not the American way, and it's not going to work for China either, I think, long term. I'm not predicting failure and not wishing for it, but I do think they're going to have huge problems with their approach over time, and we shouldn't follow them down that road.
And you guys have talked about energy a bit. There's a lot of talk about investment in clean environmental products, maybe the climate change, and certainly that area of focus could be one where who knows what kind of spin-off technologies we might see. So shifting a little bit on the politics, we'll save a little for Rick when he gets on, and what the prospects are in the House. But we do have a really interesting question that came in. Another one. It's about the legal toolbox. We've seen on the political front, China using an extraterritorial reach to try to get at people who criticize the regime, even outside of China, trying to indict some Danish parliamentarians who invited a Hong Kong, let me rephrase that, Hong Kong, outspoken person about Hong Kong politics, to visit Denmark, and they're now being investigated by Chinese authorities, it appears. China appears to be developing its own legal toolbox to mirror, that's different, again, to mirror some of the commercial things the U.S. does on tariff sanctions, export controls. What kind of ramifications will that have commercially? And what do these political tools, these extraterritorial tools, mean for U.S. competitiveness or this competition between China and the U.S.? Matt? Looks like you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're right. China is developing, or the questioner is right. China is developing a bunch of legal mechanisms that sort of do notionally monitor, track what we do in investment screening, or in export controls, or in sanctions and so forth. And, on one level, I guess you could say, fair enough. We have those tools, and China, perhaps rightly has a reason to develop. It has its own concerns about those issues, and has a right to have those legal tools. But as you suggested, the application of those tools historically, or those kinds of tools by China, are not exactly the way that we apply them. I mean, we do apply things extraterritorially, and that's a fair rap on us. But we don't, go after foreign parliamentarians. Or think tanks, as Bonnie knows, because we both were very unhappy and outraged by what the treatment of one of our fellow think tanks in Berlin after they had the temerity, or Europe had the temerity, to do something that China didn't like. This kind of thing is totally, unacceptable, and it's not the norm, and it's not the way we can, I think, allow China to proceed with these laws. So I think, again, the legal toolkit itself is not a problem, but how they're applied has to be done in a transparent way that is, aimed at the policy objective that you're trying to achieve. And we should try to hold China to that.
Rick, I'm told that the vote is started on the House floor, and Rick has already voted and is headed back to his office. So hopefully he'll be joining us momentarily. Matt, following up on that line of discussion, this is kind of reversing kind of a little where we've been, what kind of collaboration, and I think this is for both of you, this question, Naomi, as well, do we see areas of collaboration between the U.S.? We're talking about competition here. We're talking about U.S. investment to be able to compete globally, not just with China. Are there areas of cooperation in places we can work constructively with China going forward that are productive for both our economies and help workers in both countries be successful?
Yeah, I mean, that's happening. We are working on some technologies together, and when it comes to things like clean energy, potentially other technologies of the future, there's a lot that we can do in a complementary way, provided there is a fundamental basis of trust and sort of systems to ensure that we are protecting the crown jewels, as it were. But that is definitely something that we can and should seek to do. It's, I think, in our interest. And by the way, my colleague Stephanie Siegel here at CSAS is doing a project on sort of how to think about that, how to think about our interdependencies with China in technology and finance and some other areas, and looking at if we feel we are overly dependent, how to sort of selectively disengage where that's appropriate. But the general premise of this is we have a lot of reason to think we could cooperate and collaborate on joint development of technology in some areas.
And Naomi, just kind of in the same vein, obviously in the communications side, there's been a lot of, the Huawei issues and ZTE and other things, and with the overlay of the China security law, how does that complicate collaboration, or not, I should be careful how I use that word, cooperation between the US and China and US-Chinese businesses and working with Chinese businesses?
Yeah, I think cooperation and coordination is absolutely essential. But right now, it's very much lip service. It's really hard to identify concrete areas of cooperation when the relationship is so fraught. And I think policymakers in particular need to be careful not to vilify Chinese people. When they talk about the Chinese government. Those are two separate and distinct entities, regardless of what anyone tells you. And we need to tread very carefully there. China is still a great resource for us in terms of skills, and we want to attract the best and the brightest, regardless of their country of origin, and that certainly shouldn't be a dispositive factor in evaluating, whether or not something or someone constitutes a security threat. I mean, if you look at what we stand to gain from working with China on things like climate change and pandemics and controlling future pandemics, I think they far outweigh the potential negatives of cooperation with China. And we need to keep that in mind, that these are global issues with global impact. And they're not just this could possibly pose a threat hypothetical. They are real, they're happening now, and they're going to continue to happen into the future.
Recently testified at a hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee, which was on strategic competition with China. And one of the topics that came up was whether we should be limiting US investment in China. So we've clearly revised the guidelines for Chinese investment in the United States with CFIUS, and we've seen a plummeting of Chinese investment in the US. The question is whether we should be limiting our investment in China and in Chinese companies. So would either of you like to comment on that?
I think we may have, not to dodge the question, but is Representative Larsen on? So here we go. You want to hear from him, not from me. So go ahead.
All right. Good to see you, Representative Larsen. Great to have you for this conversation. Thanks for joining us. We do have probably about 13 minutes left. So we're going to give some time to you. What do you think is the key aspect of competition with China that's most worrisome to you? And what's your evaluation of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act? Whatever you want to talk about. Over to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, ask me any question you want, Bonnie. I think I'll just read what I prepared because it gets at your questions, and I'm excited to find out what question Ken is avoiding as well. So glad to help on that regard, Ken. So I want to thank everyone and appreciate your patience. We just finished voting, and I want to cover that as well because it's relevant to the question. So first off, I want to thank the Washington International Trade Association for inviting me and have been voting and exercising my constitutional duty. And now we are out for a couple of weeks, so folks will be back in their districts. But I think in thinking about Congress right now and China, there's a broad consensus that's really in line with where the Biden-Harris team is, and that China is seen as a strategic competitor first, and there are areas of cooperation as well. I think maybe 10 years ago, we could have said cooperation first, but understanding we're competing in places. I think that's sort of been flipped on its head over the last several years. And that's how Congress sees it, in human rights, on technology competition, Chinese government economic policies all provide challenges, and my rubric to describe members of Congress is really to see them in groups of being punishers, decouplers, and engagers. Punishers in that policies, people want to have policies that punish Chinese government policy for one reason or another on human rights and so on. Decouplers, in some senses, are good when you're looking at pharmaceutical supply chains and maybe some of the technology problems and challenges in national security that we have. But others just want U.S. companies not to do business at all with China. I don't think that's realistic, but there's a group of members of Congress like that. And then there's the engagers, which I would put myself in. Basically, I would almost call it the salvagers, trying to salvage those areas where cooperation can happen and ought to happen in our own interests, not in China's interests, but in our own interests. But when you're looking at the competitiveness issue, Bonnie and others, I think, right now we are trying to bolster U.S. competitiveness and innovation. And although I haven't been on the call, I have my notes from my staff has been listening in, a lot of conversation about the Senate bill, USICA, U.S. Innovation and Competitive Act, Competition Act. I do think that it is important that we in the House take action. We aren't going to take action on USICA. We're going to take action on the individual bills that really line up with what is happening in the Senate bill. And that's largely a function of being the House of Representatives more than anything else. For those who track politics closely, you'll understand institutionally, Congress, the House does different things differently than the way the Senate does them. And in fact, this week we passed the National Science Foundation for the Future Act, which is part of USICA. We passed the Department of Energy Science for the Future Act, which is part of USICA as well. And yesterday, the House Foreign Affairs Committee marked up Chair Gregory Meek's bill, the Ensuring American Global Leadership and Engagement Act, or the EAGLE Act, which strengthens and focuses U.S. diplomatic efforts, which again, thematically is part of USICA. There's other things going on in other bills. Last year, we passed the authorizing bill for the CHIPS Act as part of the defense bill. The president is proposing the funding for that bill as well. And I want to shift to where I just came from, the floor of the House, because for all the talk about innovation and competition relative to China, a lot of this has to occur for its own sake for the United States. We should be doing this whether or not we have a strategic competitor in China. These are actually good things to do on their own. And when I think about the last 17 months and the pandemic and the economy, it is fair to say, in my view, that we are defeating the pandemic, but it is not yet defeated. The US economy is emerging, but it is not yet emerged. And so the passage today of the Invest in America Act, which is the House of Representatives portion of the American Jobs Plan that invests in roads, bridges, highways, transit, rail, wastewater infrastructure, clean water infrastructure, and then follow-on bills that will include broadband and some other things. That's an investment in the competitive advantage of the United States itself. And that, internal or domestic focus is as important in ensuring U.S. competitiveness relative to China and any other Chinese and any other country as a bill like USICA or its component elements as we're addressing it in the U.S. House. But there's more to be done as well. Safeguarding our democracy. We have a very serious soft power message to send to the rest of the world that we care about our democracy, we care about voting rights, and it is as important a message to send to the rest of the world as well as we deal with challenges from Russia and interference in elections, as well as Chinese government policy relative to what some of the actions that the Chinese government's taking in other countries. So, I just want to be sure that to give this conversation context, and I apologize, it can be at the beginning, and it's kind of wrapping up, but I would have said the same thing at the beginning as well. The context of this is, in my view, as a member of Congress, is not just US v. China. It's US present versus what the US ought to be in the future. And that itself helps this whole conversation about a US v. China conversation. So, and we're taking those actions, and that's kind of the point I wanted to make at the beginning. So maybe that wraps up the entire conversation for the last hour. I don't know, but I'll turn it back over to you, Bonnie.
Thanks, Rick. Well, we have some questions from the audience, and maybe I'll ask you one of those. There was a question about the fact that more than half of the Republican senators did vote no on the bill. And the question first is whether we can still call it a bipartisan bill. So maybe you can talk about whether there are significant differences in how the House has broken down the bill and what's been passed so far and what's in the Senate bill. And then there's a broader question, which actually I think is more interesting, about whether there's really any significant difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of China policy in the House. People often talk about how there's consensus in Congress on our policy and approach toward China. So is there really?
Yeah. So on the first question, although I think it's an interesting question to ask, I'm still more focused on what do we end up with, as opposed to how do we end up with it. I think we need to first focus on the question, is it important to do? And if people want to, vote against the final product because it doesn't have their specific set of interests in it, they're going to do that. And the policy process is going to kind of massage those criticisms either into the product or out of the product. But I think just the recognition that we need to do a better job of focusing our investment in innovation and the U.S. competitive advantage in our economy, first and foremost, is where to start, as opposed to, and this is my view only, and it's a view that can be argued and debated, rather than focusing on whether something's bipartisan enough or not. That's where I would start, because I think the fundamental question is much broader and bigger than that. And the second bit was about What was the second question?
Second question is about the broader approach to China policy and whether
Oh.
there's a consensus.
I think, when I talk about a consensus, I don't mean that every member of Congress, Democratic or Republican member of Congress, agrees on everything. But the approach to China has fundamentally shifted within the halls of Congress, within the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. It isn't what it was during I've been here 20 years, so I can't go back really farther than that much, but I've been in the House for 20 years. This is not the Congress of the Bush administration or the Obama administration in terms of having many more engagers, many more folks who are focused on economic policy and investment in China. That has shifted. It started with the previous administration. It's continuing in this administration, but I think the approach in this administration has been more on, first off, we got to take seriously our own domestic economy and recovery coming out of the pandemic. We have to take seriously the value of multilateral relationships and to address some of these very specific concerns we have on technology and technology security, on human rights, even on climate change, which is an area of cooperation with China. So I think that the consensus is more about tone and approach as opposed to every policy, but it's definitely a tougher approach towards U.S. policy towards China.
This has been a terrific session. I'm so glad, Representative Larsen, that you could jump in and join us for the last few minutes. Really important work, of course, that you're doing in the House, and thanks for all your work over the years on China policy. I'm glad to hear that you are an engager. We still need engagers. And frankly, I think some of the other approaches have been a bit unhelpful. But we need to have some people who can balance the conversation with China, and the focus on competition is extremely important in how we keep our country a leader in innovation and compete with companies across the world to ensure that we write the rules of the 21st century. So with that, I'll thank everybody for joining us today. Rick and Matt Goodman, Naomi Wilson, and Ken and WITA. Thanks so much for having us. Very important conversation, and I'm sure we'll all be following this legislation as it makes its way through the House and the committee, and then hopefully, ultimately, it becomes a piece of legislation that gets passed into law.
Thank you so very much. Rick, thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Your past WITA award winner, and it's always an honor and a pleasure to share the stage with you. Matt, really great to have you on the WITA platform. Naomi, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you and your insights and the work you're doing. Bonnie, as always, thank you so much for your help with this event. Really grateful to all of you. Thanks to our audience for adjusting with us on the fly to the congressional schedule and the calendar. Thank you so much to our panel. Everybody, if you're watching out there, be safe, and when you're eligible and able to get the shot, please do so. It's in all of our best interest for all of us to be vaccinated. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great holiday weekend.
Happy 4th.
Thank you.